So, what do you think you get if you try to show this to a class? What's going on here? I mean, they're showing a lot of different things. You've got Malcolm X giving a pretty intense speech. What's going on?
I just think it's a great clip. And you try to teach the students that there's a conflict between both movements. And they don't understand it because, for all they know, it's the same movement.
Is that right?
Yeah. And, Malcolm X comes second in our curriculum. Perfect to show.
Because you're seeing them, they're right there. They're talking to, well, Martin Luther King's not talking to Malcolm X, but Malcolm X is talking about Martin Luther King a lot.
And blatant. And,
yeah.
And so the kids are going to sort of grasp that there is a difference. And they had the platform at some.
Yeah.
Going along with that, I think it's great because it does confuse the kids. All of a sudden, I mean, every adolescent boy in that room is going to totally go along with what Denzel Washington's saying. But then we have Martin Luther King Day, and Rosa Parks, Martin Luther King, that's the civil rights movement.
Yeah.
So I think, yeah, exactly, going along with it, it's the confusion. And then you can start unpacking it from there. It's almost an intro to confusing them, to unpack what really happened.
You know, it's interesting you're saying this because when they get to college, I often find that what I have, they do know the difference in there's the good civil rights movement and the bad black nationalist movement, And then, they can sort of get into it a little bit, and this is especially with white kids. But black kids, too, will have this sense of, like, the black nationalist movement has a kind of taboo quality about it. And I think here you can really see it as more of a struggle over what this is going to mean. What is the rights movement going to look like? And I think that scene where he's watching television is pretty incredible because you see him seeing what's going on down south and yet having a very different reaction. Yeah.
I think for the kids to begin to understand it, though, they have to understand the context of where those guys live. I mean, living in Harlem is totally different than being in Alabama at that time.
Right. Can you turn the lights up a little bit? And what do you think they need to know about that? I mean, a lot, obviously. Right.
A little bit about Harlem. I mean, Harlem has a very rich history of African American culture and all this stuff going back before the 50s. In Alabama, I mean, you could, the little march you saw the guys do to the hospital, you couldn't have done that in Alabama.
No, it would have to be.
In the middle of town like that in Mississippi or Alabama.
I mean, of course, people did. That's what the movement was about. But that's how they had to be A, bigger, and B, they risked their lives.
They didn't walk like that. They walked praying with ministers.
I see what you mean. I see, yeah.
Others,
right, that aggressive.
They were marching down there dressed like that.
Yeah, I see what you mean.
Different attitude.
Yeah, it's a different background. The churches don't have the same role in the North. They're still very important, but they don't have the same kind of institutional role that they did in the South, so they don't have the same social power to organize. There are unions, there are people who are, the Nation of Islam has been active for a long time, and there's just a lot, there's of course artists and all sorts of activists who've been organizing the cities, not just in Chicago and elsewhere. So yeah, you have a much different kind of environment, and so they have the room to be more aggressive.
Yeah.
Then there's the part where he talks about the Jews. Think that somebody might pick that up, right? So what do you make about that? How would you address this, where he starts saying the Jews say this about us, the Jews who've run the stores? Yeah.
What I jotted down was, can you start the whole thing off over there talking about how there's racism on both sides?
I didn't, but.
Okay, I was listening to myself.
But you might want to say something about that now.
No, I think that's an awesome clip to do a Venn diagram with your class, comparing the two Venn diagram. But more than that, towards the end, questioning the racism on the other side of, I guess, the coin.
It's interesting. One of the critiques of this film by some, activists and scholars was that Spike Lee made Malcolm X too palatable to a white audience, that he actually downplayed some of the more controversial things that he said. So in this, he talks about this is not hate, this is love. And they want to say we're anti-Semitic, but we're not. We just want to take back our, so there is a kind of anti-Semitic moment in there, I think, where he says the Jews who've, run our stores for so long. But it's definitely, of the choices that Spike Lee could have made of Malcolm X's speeches, this is one of the, he doesn't totally take it out, but it's one of the more affirming rather than maybe some of the more aggressive speeches. So I think that is something that students will want to talk about. Now, if I were talking about it, and again, I think it's so different, what you can say, I would talk about the difference between racial prejudice or racial hostility and structural racism. So that in the sense that you can, anybody and all sorts of people do act racist to other people in the sense of having negative opinions or saying nasty things about them or not wanting them to, date their kids or whatever. But that the African Americans are facing, a power structure of racism, a structure of racism that is, goes from government law to the police force to the economy to all sorts of different structures. So that when somebody says, uses the N-word, with like those guys on the bus did with the girl many times in the clip, the part of the clip we didn't see, that comes with all of the power that they have to enforce the social, not those particular boys, but the white political and social power to enforce their own ability to, at that point, still beat up that girl, threaten that young man, hurt that young man, because they have all sorts of social structures behind them. So I always, when I want to talk about, to not give any credence to people saying racist things on either side, but also I wouldn't want to make them wouldn't want to forget the social structures that are behind white racism in these situations that aren't behind black racist language or thought. I think that's a really interesting point. And if you were getting complicated, which you might not be able to do in your classes, but you could actually imagine teaching something where you, in a genealogical fashion, you use something very contemporary like this to talk about, well, why does this kind of activism seem so, just exactly what you said, seems so threatening or seems so less acceptable? And let's look back at the history from the 19th century where what it meant to be a person who deserved to be not enslaved, right? And of course, Malcolm X talks about this all the time. He talks about Uncle Tom's. He's the person who kind of reinvigorated that as a political discourse. I mean, it was around. But so I think you could make some really interesting connections there. And you could even remind your 9th graders that they had studied 19th century history in the 8th grade, which might be important to do. If they are like mine, they forget from one semester to the next. The other thing I wanted to mention here that you might, a couple things. One is the impact of television here is something you could also point to. That is, the movie makes very clear the importance of TV in showing him watching television. And you can remind students again that this is what people were seeing on their television. And when you see that scene of him watching it and his anger and his, I think sort of almost despair when he's watching these scenes, and the scenes keep coming back and they're in that grainy television footage. So it's just reminding you that this is what people saw at home. And even if they weren't there, even if they weren't in Montgomery or Selma or wherever, Greensboro, they are white and black watching this on television at night, and it's making it a national discourse, and it's making a lot of people have some doubts about nonviolence as well. One thing that I didn't have time to do today, but I thought might be interesting, Raisin in the Sun is a movie in 1961. And so at about the same time that this stuff is happening, this play, now movie, is made available to Americans, right? It's made as a movie in 1961, which also talks about, and this comes back to the history of Harlem, a family that has, influenced by decolonization, trying to deal with housing issues in the city, trying to be able to move into a white neighborhood and finding themselves threatened with violence. A young woman who wears an afro and very early on, and what that means in her family. And that could be a very interesting film to show or show clips of, not only because it tells about history, but also because it is part of that history. It's just like the fact that you can watch the TV clips to say, look, this is what happened in Birmingham. Or you can show students the clips and say, look, this is what people were seeing on TV. This is part of the history. This television isn't just a document of what happened. It's actually something that's helping influence how people are thinking at the time. And the same with a play or a movie like Raisin in the Sun, which is not just telling us about a particular family in the North that we can sort of use as an example of urban Black life, but also is made and shown and part of the discussion about what is civil rights, what are the rights people have, what are the problems they face, what should we do about it. So seeing films, especially films that are made at the time, as part of a discussion, or seeing television as part of the ongoing discussion about civil rights. It's not just activists having the discussion. It's also people who are making and watching culture. Is that making sense as my little point there? Okay. I have about a fairly long clip, but one I think we can still have time to discuss a little bit from a documentary that I thought would be worth looking at that takes up some of these same themes in a different way. This is a documentary clip. When I always taught this, I always go back to Eyes on the Prize because it's so amazing. But this is a shorter clip, so therefore maybe useful in classrooms, from a unfortunately titled documentary, Free at Last, Civil Rights Heroes. Of course, we talked about what is leadership and heroes, and this terminology is a little bit problematic, but this is a kind of interesting clip about the murders and the reactions to them. And what I want to highlight here, I think it's a good clip, but it also does some of the same kinds of things that the fiction films do, in that it is looking to, well, even more than some of the film we saw first, is looking for saints. And it really wants these guys to be saints. And it really wants the reaction to their deaths to be saintly. Now, you all know Goodman, Cheney, Swarmer were the guys who went down, 3 young men who were doing Freedom Summer in Mississippi in 1964, and who were, as you'll see here, taken out and killed. 2 of them were white guys from the North, white Jewish guys, which, given what we were just talking about, is also probably worth having available to your students if you're discussing this stuff, and a young black man from Mississippi. At the end, there's a funeral that you will see a very short clip from, where a guy named Dave Dennis gives the eulogy, or gives part of the eulogy. And we see this short clip where he says, I blame, the institutions, not just the people who did this. And then off we go with the glorious story of nonviolent civil rights. But what Dave Dennis actually said, they don't have to put it up, I can just read it. He says what we see, I know what's going to happen. They're going to find the people who killed these guys, and then the jury's going to acquit them. And then he says, at the end of his eulogy, I've been approached by the people of my national office at CORE, and that is to make sure that this speech that's given is calm. They don't want a lot of, things stirred up and everything else like that. And I agreed to do that. And I said, okay, fine, that's good. And then when I got up here and I looked out and I saw little Ben Cheney, James Cheney's little brother, things just sort of snapped, and I was in a fantasy world. To be sitting up here talking about things are going to get better and we should do it in an easy manner and nonviolence and stuff like that, because this country, you cannot make a man change by speaking a foreign language. He doesn't understand what you're talking about. This country operated then and still operates on violence. I mean, as you've said, an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, that's what we respect. So you have at this moment that actually does not show up in this film, even though they show a clip from that same speech, where the nonviolent movement itself is beginning to have real questions about the efficacy of what they're doing after these, especially after these, well, a lot of people have been killed at that point. I will say also that, though it's not here, it's in the Eyes on the Prize documentary, when Rita Schwerner, the wife of Michael Schwerner, is first interviewed after he's missing, and they pretty much know they're dead, but it's not certain. Somebody asks her how she feels, and she starts by saying, this is a tragedy. And you expect her to say, my husband, who is so wonderful, and we were committed, and he gave his life for this cause. And when she says, it is a tragedy that it took a white person being killed for you all to take notice. And that was somebody who, was a deeply political person in the sense that she was committed and she understood what had happened. And she also understood, as all of the people who organized Freedom Summer did, and Taylor Branch says this, that they tried to get white college students to come help register African American voters in Mississippi for a reason. And the reason was exactly what happened. If somebody was hurt or somebody was killed, America would pay attention. It wouldn't be the kind of thing that they could just ignore some local African American people who were getting killed all the time, and there was intermittent attention. And they didn't mean, of course, for any people to get killed. That was not the intention. But they knew that if anything went wrong, it was white people whose injury or death would draw the attention more than African Americans, probably. And that's part of the thing I was talking about earlier, about thinking about what these movements did, what strategies they had, how sophisticated and real, not naive people were in thinking about what was required to do to make this movement. Anything else you want to say about this documentary? Did anything?
I thought it was great.
Did you like it?
Very well done and succinct and very useful.
Yeah, I like that. They do something Eyes on the Prize doesn't, which is they use heavy narration, and it gets you through things more quickly. And I think it's different than fictional movies because you don't get those young men as much as you would like to. Their personalities, who they were. Nobody gets to embody them. But at least you have some sense of the events and I think it's just the real tragedy of it. Right? So this, I think, is probably pretty showable in class, right?
It's also very rich in terms of the curriculum, which you might not care about, but as teachers,
I do care, I just don't know.
Right, yeah,
Things you have to cover?
Yeah, in terms of
State indicators.
Yeah,
Like it fits in really well with
SNCC and CORE and Freedom Summer and had a lot of hits.
Tick.
Yeah.
Yeah, good.
Yeah.
And the other thing I think, again, though, you might be able to get your students to think about the tone of the documentary just like we think about the tone of fiction films. It's so much harder. Fiction films wear their hearts on the sleeves in a way. This is the view of the young fruits of Islam that is being presented by this movie. It's so clear. We are to admire them, right? Or this is the lovely woman who walks all the way home and we love her, right? And documentaries often are not as clear, but there is a clear, and this is what I was trying to make apparent with my quote, there's a clear sense throughout this whole documentary of a kind of idealizing of the people in the civil rights movement, many of whom I think really deserve to be idealized, but it doesn't show, how you talked about how the Malcolm X shows tension, shows a debate, shows a movement that has really different components where people disagree. This does not do that, right? It's a very different tone of a more unified, we are all together making this movement. And I think both can be really useful, but to try to get people to see that, and again, when you see what it doesn't show about that funeral at the end, the part where the young man at the funeral gets angrier and angrier, and you begin to see people even he was a core worker, Dave Dennis, who begin to get disillusioned with whether nonviolence will work. And so